You're watching the News Hour on TRT World. We're going to now look at some of the stories that have caught our eye, particularly today. And with me to review them are the French-Algerian journalist and broadcaster, Nabila Ramdani. Thank you so much, Nabila. And Juliet Foster, journalist and TV presenter, who I know very well because we used to work together at another age.
Yeah, we were catching up on old times.
OK, so, wow, there's this story that it's made the rounds recently because we spent about 15, 16 minutes at the top of this bulletin looking at the humanitarian catastrophe that's developing in northwestern Syria. And you know, all of these millions of people who have been forced to leave the country, let alone the ones that are still there, and you see their children and the drawings that they do. You've seen them, right?
Yes, trauma drawings.
Of bombs dropping from the air, of stick men bleeding and everything. And you consider how children deal with the trauma of war. There's a story of a young girl, she's 3 years old, her name is Salwa. Our correspondent Obey Hito met her recently, and we'll hear a clip from her dad in a moment. But their story, Juliet, do you want to tell it? Because you know it as well as I do, right?
Yeah, I mean, basically, you've got this little girl whose father has taught her to laugh whenever bombs detonate.
Yeah.
But what he's done, he's actually an extremely clever man, because when she was a little bit younger, some children were playing with firecrackers and the explosions scared her. So he talked her through it. So he's told her, look, every time you hear these bombs go up, these are just like the firecrackers. So we all laugh. Now, there's something slightly cartoonish about it. If you stand outside the convention, the idea of dropping bombs, things explode. But of course, we know that some of these bombs are hardcore nasty. You're talking about barrel bombs which have got high-powered explosives, etc. in them.
Yes.
So you really have to tip your hat off to the father, because he is trying to preserve the child within the child. Now, he was lucky because he saw that before they were displaced. He's trying to preserve that. But what I found really touching about the story, and actually quite heart-wrenching, was that he said, well, I can't do this forever, so he's going to have to find an alternative narrative. But, and I'm really glad that you guys have covered this story, because I think that whenever we watch stories about Syria on the media, we've become desensitised to them. We were shocked by them when we first heard about this. We heard appalling stories, allegations of cruelty on the part of the government, even towards young children who had protested at the very beginning.
That's exactly
of
how
that
it
journey.
all began. Those boys who had drawn some graffiti against the regime, and then it all began.
Tortured and their bodies brutalised. And then, of course, I mean, you know the news narrative because we've covered it many times ourselves now, well, certainly for me in my former life working elsewhere. But you see how the story develops, but then it reaches a point where it kind of saturates. And you see it, you're shocked, but then it doesn't impact on you in the same way. This story has really brought it back to us. It's reconnected us to ourselves.
I agree, and this is why such videos are so important, because they remind us, people outside Syria, what daily life is, you know, what Syrians go through day in, day out, and indeed how, you know, death and destruction are part of, sadly, daily life of people in Syria. And this has been going on for far too long. And the idea of, you know, high explosives, you know, dropping on civilian communities and traumatizing children. I mean, this father is clearly distressed at the situation, and he is trying to, you know, preserve his little girl's, you know, state of innocence. He can either spend all day crying about the situation or make out that it's all a bit of a joke. The saddest part, of course, is when this little girl will grow up, she will realise the sheer horror of the situation and all these childish games that he's playing with her at the moment.
And it touches on the need to actually have that psychological support when this is over. It will end. We don't know when.
Yeah. OK, listen, let's hear from her dad, Abdullah, who spoke to our correspondent, Obey Hito, when they met recently. So here's Abdullah Al-Mohammed, Salwa's dad.
كيف ضحك معه؟ قذيفي كيف ضحك.
OK, so that's the visual representation of the story we're talking about. And, OK, I'm going to link it to this next story, OK, because we've also, during the course of this news hour, looked at the new immigration system that the British Home Secretary has introduced in early next year. People who don't earn more than about $23,000, about $30,000, I think it is, won't be allowed into the country. They won't get their visas to work in this nation. But while she was announcing that, Priti Patel said, remember, none of this is going to change the British government's attitude towards asylum seekers and refugees. Syrian refugees don't really come under that category. They have a special category for them. The UK has 15,000. This comes from the UK House of Commons Library, which published in March last year the figures of 15,000 Syrian refugees living in this country. You know what I've said to my kids? My young 15-year-old daughter, she said a few years ago, Daddy, I want us to adopt a Syrian refugee. And I said, okay, we'll talk about it. And she said, what about why aren't there more living here? I said, what I would like, Adia, is for David Cameron, the Prime Minister, to go and live with his family in Aleppo, just for 1 week, and then come back to the UK. And I'm being idealistic. I'm talking to a young girl. You know, she's 15 now. She wasn't then. And I'm talking to her almost as if the way Mohammed is talking to his young daughter and giving her an idea of why this country isn't accepting as many Syrian refugees as many others. You were saying that Germany took in more than a million.
Yeah.
And it created its own problems within Germany. We know about that. But what about this issue of asylum seekers and refugees coming to the UK and this country's attitude? What do you make of it?
Well, the reality is that, you know, all of us gathered around the table, what we know is that you have Syrians who've been traumatised. They're trying to get by as best as they can. But if you are in Whitehall, where immigration is a hot-button issue, Syrians are from over there, and there are probably going to be lots of terrorists in that group, whoever you let in. Now, this isn't my train of thought, but I think that this is something which is very clear in the thinking of the government. And I hate to say this, but it's also been aided and abetted by the media whenever there have been instances where you may have Syrians who've been involved in terrorist acts or people who've been radicalised by extreme preachers in Syria, whatever. There is that connection, and the drawbridge goes up. And 15,000 Syrians is pretty pathetic when you compare that to Germany. Angela Merkel taking a risk. Some would say, well, she was a fool to do this, but I would say she was actually very clever. She was responding to a humanitarian instinct, but Angela Merkel was thinking ahead, because most of the people were actually moving to the east, and that is where you've got the economic drag on Germany. So if you actually get people living and working there, their children will become Germanic. They'll speak German. They'll have that German way of life, etc.
And the birth rate in Western Europe is falling anyway.
Exactly.
So you need some immigration.
It makes sense. It makes sense, but I think it's something which has bypassed us in this country.
Yes, and it's fair to say that the countries which are actually bearing the brunt of the refugee crisis are neighbouring countries to Syria.
Yeah.
Predominantly Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and in Europe, Germany has to be, I agree with you, Julia, it has to be praised for
along with
its
Sweden.
policy.
Definitely.
Other Western countries are less so welcoming. France, for example, bizarrely only allow Christian Syrians and small numbers of them as well. And it has to be said that in the lead up to the Brexit vote, there has been conflation between, you know, refugees and foreign threats, such as terrorism or aggression.
I think we probably all as journalists had people say it to us, you know, that it's their justification for their particular set of beliefs.
Security issues, I think that's the key word. It's the cover-all, really, the cover-all expression.
Got about 90 seconds or so, Nabila. And what's your take on these 9 mayors in France from towns very close to Paris who have said it's not permissible or legal to become sick? I don't know exactly what's going on.
Well, this is clearly, in my mind, you know, a very silly stunt to get publicity. I mean, considering how many people who will undoubtedly be very ill, seriously ill in that area, I think it's pretty insulting for mayors who are clearly not health professionals to waste, you know, resources, including time and money, in getting involved in such publicity stunts. I think there's health is a massive issue in modern democracy. It's hugely expensive, and you know, it's getting more and more of an issue as we have an aging population. But I firmly believe that these kind of debates should be led by health professionals, doctors and nurses, and in a rational way and a measured way, rather than self-conscious or publicity-conscious politicians.
Yeah, it's not actually a law, though. It's
a gesture.
Yes, that's right.
It also shows the divide between the town and the country, because this has happened in rural areas. And this is the problem, getting those medical services into that infrastructure, because most of the doctors, one assumes, they're actually going to the towns, they're going to Paris, because they can work there, perhaps make some more money if they went into private practice, etc. But I absolutely agree with you that, OK, it's a gesture, it's a protest, but you need to have the health professionals and governments actually sitting down and working through that town and country divide, because it shouldn't really be there.
Yeah, but actually the chap who's the president of the Association of Rural Mayors here in this area of South, near Paris, where all these towns' mayors have said, the 9 of them, that you can't have access to medical attention if you become sick, but you can, you're welcome, please, go to Paris. He said that more than 70,000 people, 70,000 people out of 560,000 don't have access to a doctor. That's, as you said, is pretty much a problem in most Western countries. You know, how long do we wait for an NHS appointment? A long time.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, my knee.
Now that's
couple of
called
weeks.
old age.
I know. Yeah. Thank you. OK, you used to know me as a younger man. OK. Nabila and Juliet, thank you so much indeed.
Thank you so much.
OK, as I said to the guests yesterday, I'm here for 3 weeks, so I'm hoping I'll see you again during those 3
think
weeks.
you will.
OK, really appreciate it. Thank you
Brilliant,
so
thanks
much.
a lot.